It's been 10,000 years. And after all that waiting, Hollow Knight Silksong has finally been released. It's a surreal feeling, I must say. It was only earlier this year that people were still making jokes about how it would never come out, and that everyone hyped for the game was coping every time there was a gaming presentation. And then all of a sudden we start getting used and it releases within a matter of months. 7 years of development. 7 years. I was still in high school when I played the original game. Jeez, that's a long time. And in that time, this game has gone on to become the most highly anticipated indie game in recent memory. Arguably a contender for the most anticipated game, period. However, as the space between the present and the release began to close, a concern started nagging at me. I started thinking of its rough development history, my experience with the first game, the reputation of the first game, the massive hype surrounding Silksong, what could reasonably be expected from the game, the fact that in prior years I experienced 2 massively disappointing follow-ups to indie games I really liked, and much, much more. After mulling it over for a while, my expectation became something along the lines of, the game may end up being really good, but no matter how good it is, it likely won't feel like it took 7 years to make. Now that the game is out, what's the verdict? Well, you probably read the title. That was pretty spot on. Silksong is not a game I would willingly wait 7 years to play, but overall it's still a great game. I would say it's on par with the original Hollow Knight. I know for many that may sound like some pretty incredible praise, but I am in the camp of people who, even though I really like the first game, I don't see it as the perfect 10 out of 10 masterpiece it's often hyped up as. Silksong is still really good. Some things are done better, some things are done worse, but many of the original game's qualities are still here. If you like the first game, I can't recommend it enough. It is absolutely worth playing. That does come with a big asterisk tied to it. There are some pretty significant changes to how the game plays, functions, and even progresses. I don't know how much of a turnoff that would be for some people, but fundamentally, just about everything is here and accounted for. Now, what about the game itself? Well, it should be worth noting I won't be focusing on the story too much. As you would expect, it's not a major component of the game anyway. Neither of these games make their story the primary focus, but that being said, there is a point in Silksong that will be pretty confusing unless you have at least a passing knowledge of the first game's lore. And that didn't exactly do me any favors. To say that I am familiar with Hollow Knight lore is to say that I am unfamiliar with Kirby lore. And I'm not exactly willing to read through dozens of wiki pages just to understand what happens in certain parts. So I'll just go through my playthrough roughly in chronological order and cover the story when it's relevant. Anyway, enough preamble, let's get into this thing. The game opens up with an FMV cutscene where our protagonist and fan-favorite character from the last game, Hornet, who I only just learned through playing this game, is a spider. Yes, I was very dumb back. She's being carried in a cage across what seems to be a very extensive length, before crossing over a bridge where a white butterfly seems to break a seal on the cage, causing Hornet to unleash silk threads at the couriers, causing the bridge to crumble and her to fall to her doom. As you do. In a very stark contrast to the first Hollow Knight, we begin not on the surface and go down into the deep and dilapidated world, but start at the bottom of the map, or at least close to it, and ascend our way towards the still underground and dilapidated. This sounds like a shit world to live in. And thus, we begin Act 1. Yes, this game has an act-based structure. Honestly a bit torn on whether this was justified or not. It's definitely a weird direction for a Metroidvania, but hey, as long as it's not detrimental to the gameplay, there's no problem. Speaking of which, the first zone is exceedingly simple. A chance to refamiliarize yourself with everything returning from the original game, attacks, jumps, upward and downward attacks, as well as everything new like the changes to how healing works, the little ledge grab, and the new trajectory of the downward attacks. Nothing in this first area is particularly taxing. Not the enemies, not the platforming, or the first boss, which probably means there's going to be a refight at some point with 2 of them at once. Ooh. Hornet also seems to be affected by something. I'm not entirely sure what happens here, even after beating the game. I would like to say it's because her body finally caught up with a 100-foot fall, or I guess 100-centimeter fall. Wait, you're a spider, how the hell are you hurt by? But this happens again after a particular plot point, so it probably has something to do with that. Still couldn't tell you what this is or why it happens. It isn't even that consequential anyway, and honestly, it kinda just slows the game down. Nevertheless, she faints and is greeted by this old maid. Now we can talk about something that I think this game does significantly better than the first one, and that's how Silksong has an immediately more engaging plot, mostly because there actually is a plot this time around. Okay, let me explain. In the first game, you are clueless. No, really. In every sense, you are wandering around aimlessly and trying to figure out what's going on. You get a glimpse of the final boss, and you gradually learn there's some sort of infection breaking loose, but you don't know who you are, what you are, where you are, why you are, when you are, or even how you are for that matter. You don't know the significance of what you saw at the start, what's inside it, what the deal with that first boss is, who Hornet is, or why you're the one who's going to fix whatever's going on here. You can learn a bit from the NPCs, but as far as the beginning is concerned, you learn that the egg is shrouded in mystery, which you already knew, and that it's dangerous beneath the surface, which you already would have assumed. There is a reason all this is happening, but it's all buried within obscure lore about the entire history of this kingdom, and even with the Dream Needle, it's not easy to piece together. Compared to Silksong, even if it's your first Hollow Knight game and you have no clue who Hornet is or what's up with the world, this quick interaction with the maid establishes the perfect amount of information to get you invested. There's a citadel at the highest point of the land, just ahead is a camp full of pilgrims who are all trying to get there, and Hornet wants to get there as well to find out who captured her and why. It may not sound like much, but this quick addition of context does wonders. You don't need to have a sliver of a grasp on any of the obscure history and lore to understand what's happening, because now there's a tangible surface to the story instead of mostly being what's beneath the surface. The obscure history and deep lore is definitely a big appeal of the first game, but the direction Silksong takes is one I massively prefer, because in all honesty, I don't think that... Okay, I wasn't supposed to rant this early into a review that's supposed to be positive, but there's plenty of discussion to be had on whether stories are necessary to enjoy a game. My simple answer to that is... it depends on the game. Yeah, wild take, right? My less simple answer is no, but a good story can elevate any game to new heights. But not only that, not providing enough of a story can potentially be harmful to the experience. You see, you'd be hard-pressed to find someone complaining that Tetris doesn't have a plot explaining why blocks are falling from the sky, but you might find someone, like me for instance, who get the true ending in Hollow Knight and immediately ask themselves, hold on, why did the final boss go from vessel containing the heart of the infection to God of Light in his dreams? Unless you deliberately engage with the lore of the game, you will never figure out the answer to that or why it's significant. The difference between this and, I don't know, some random filler boss is that filler bosses don't really need any background. They're just there to be a threat or challenge along your journey. If you don't learn about them, you don't lose out on anything. But the difference between those and something like Radiance speaks for itself. It's the true final boss, the grand finale, and it almost comes out of nowhere. If you beat a game, especially after a boss as difficult as Radiance, you want to feel some sort of accomplishment. And you do get that in terms of gameplay from the difficulty alone, but unless you went out of your way to put bits and pieces of the story together, you get less of a sense of accomplishment and more of a feeling of, wait, was that a good thing? There's always a difference between avoiding unnecessary exposition and not giving enough information for an average player to understand what's happening. And in general, this tends to be one of my biggest criticisms towards Hollow Knight. Now, I wouldn't even say that Hollow Knight or even other games like Dark Souls are the most offensive examples of this happening. Off the top of my head, that would be none other than Hyper Light Drifter. This game right here is the definition of a game that suffers from a lack of a properly conveyed story. The game doesn't use a single letter outside of menus and button prompts, so you couldn't even figure out what anything you see is named if you tried. This can definitely be effective for a puzzle-solving setting, and the game even does that part relatively well, but barely does shit to help you understand what's going on in this world, why you should be invested, why the final boss needed to be beaten, let alone what you actually accomplish when you finally finish the game. Of course, games like this still appeal to a lot of people because of all that obscurity, and if you ask me, I think Silksong sits in a perfect middle ground. The surface of the story you get is exceedingly simple, but by giving a logical through line and rational reason for the main character to go through this journey, the game becomes much more engaging. You don't need to learn all the extensive history of Farloom or the origins of half the bosses because the end goal is already established, and that's enough. The other seams of the story will unravel as you go. And it will give just enough for you to follow along, and to make the end of the game feel climactic. Though the first ending of the game is absolutely an anticlimax, but that's not any fault of the game's writing. Don't worry, we'll get there. Moral of the story for this rant is 1. Being invested in a game's story requires context more so than an in-depth understanding of its lore, and 2. Don't play Hyper Light Drifter, it's not even that good and it might give you carpal tunnel. Now with our goal in mind, it's time to make the journey with a very familiar gameplay loop. going around, fighting enemies, fighting bosses, unlocking new abilities, and advancing further and further. It's the standard Metroidvania fare. You know, my memory of the first game was very fuzzy until I briefly played it for a bit of background footage, but that reminded me of a lot of things, and I think I can safely say Silksong controls so much better. I remember the first game's controls not being perfect, but compared to Silksong, it's like biking on a road versus skateboarding on gravel. You can see this the most in how dashing feels. In Silksong, it's like you briefly zip in one direction, but in Hollow Knight, it's like you gradually move from A to B with slightly faster speed. It feels stiff. You can also see this in the self-healing ability. This one's a bit more self-explanatory because you input these moves differently, and I don't think it's controversial to say that hold inputs aren't as responsive as normal press inputs, but it goes further than that. In Silksong, you don't need to be grounded or at a standstill to start the animation. As soon as you hit the button, you go into it. Self-healing is a bit more of a risk in this game because it costs more and you can't cancel out of the animation until you finish or get hit, but the snappiness and responsiveness of the ability makes it feel like a natural part of the flow of combat and not something you feel like you have to effectively pause the game for. Exploration has also been greatly improved. The snappiness of the controls alone makes it 10 times more fun, and the movement abilities being better overall helps too. Wall and double jumping don't feel as floaty, you can glide like your goddamn Princess Peach. When you get Silk Sword late in the game, it's very satisfying to use. But not only that, even though biomes are about as expansive as they were before, you can get through them much faster now that holding the dash button makes you run. The game's environments for the most part also have a lot of differences and quirks. Like the first game, the platforming isn't all that taxing. Once again, the focus is on the combat. Of course, when the game decides to go all in on platforming, it gets pretty wild and fun. These quirks in the environments can do a lot to separate themselves from another, and even give some insight to them. And it also does a lot to keep the platforming fresh and interesting from zone to zone. Except for Bilewater. As we travel through the first act, it becomes pretty clear that our kidnapping wasn't arbitrary. Hornet is half spider, and we begin to learn that they are very important to the history of Farloom. Whether it be the ancient structures, or the effigies offering you new power, the silk threads driving pilgrims mad, or the actual goddamn spiders you fight. Whatever the reason Hornet was brought here, it's clear that she was wanted for something. What that something isn't clear yet. The most notable encounter we get is with her. This is Lace, a being made entirely out of silk. She is more or less a rival-like character, even though she only gets 2/3 encounters throughout the game. Her first encounter is a bit of a throwaway, even compared to Hornet's first encounter, but she will have much more significance later on. For now, we continue to make our way to the Citadel, encountering various worms, ants, flies, and instead of rescuing caterpillars, we rescue fleas. Aww. Oh yeah, Silksong also has a dedicated quest system, and it works exactly as you would expect. Talk to certain NPCs, or check the board in safe zones, kill a thing, do a thing, or find a thing, report back to get stuff like currency, key items, or even build new structures to liven the place up. Ignore that. Overall, these are standard run-of-the-mill fetch quests, with some notable exceptions. Some have you fighting unique bosses, some involve story related to the recurring characters. The delicate flower quest from the first game returns with a vengeance with the courier missions, only 10 million times better because you can actually afford to take damage now. Excuse me. Out of all of them, I think my favorite one was the one where you harvest meat from slain enemies by killing them with tools, and the types of meat you get correlate to the type of tool you use. Yeah, pretty morbid, isn't it? But then again, we're playing as a half spider, and it's a world of insects. If cannibalism isn't normal in this world, then what the hell is? Let's continue on to the end of Act 1 as we go through perilous and windy terrain full of sand that's coarse, rough. I can't bring myself to finish that joke. As we continue, we find out that some of the pilgrims have actually made it here. Yeah, considering how difficult this journey was for someone as agile as Hornet, that's quite the achievement. How the hell did you lowlives make it? Though, speaking of environmental storytelling, one bit I really like is how this game handles currency drops. Some enemies will drop the game's main currency, rosaries, and the amount they drop, as you would expect, increases the further you get into the game. But there's actually a reason for that. Rosaries are a currency, and the people of Farloom presumably use it like we do. So the amount of rosaries enemies drop is actually a literal representation of their wealth. We start with the possessed pilgrims, who only drop a few. Then we move to the developed areas where they start to drop more, and by the time we reach the Citadel where we fight soldiers and elite guards, they're dropping boatloads. There is actual in-universe justification for the scaling of currency drops to the point that when we first enter the Citadel and get sent to the Underworks, rusty slums full of worker drones and rental benches, the enemies are back to dropping only a few at a time. It's a really cool detail. But now, we've reached the end of Act 1. We fight off a tough boss with an annoying amount of backtracking for the nearest bench. We open this big door and we have finally reached the Citadel, thus beginning Act 2. To give a summary of Act 1, it's good. A solid introduction to the game, its premise, and its gameplay. There were some cool locales and fun boss fights. It was a fun little journey. But for a Metroidvania, it was shockingly linear. It was basically a straight line from start to finish, with very few branching paths outside of slight detours to get the ability needed to move on. In order to open the door to the Citadel, you would need to ring all the bells throughout the journey, but you can't really miss them. If I missed one, I would have needed to backtrack, but they were barely off the beaten path anyway, so I'm not sure why this is here. Now, that's not to say there's no feeling of exploration and that Act 1 is bad because of this structure. It's still pretty fun. But it's been said a million times before and is still worth repeating. Genre, series, all that stuff carries expectations with it. A Metroidvania comes with the expectations of exploration and some level of non-linearity. Act 1 serves as a great action platformer, but less so as a Metroidvania. Now Act 2, on the other hand? Now that we're in the Citadel, we can finally chase after who or whatever captured Hornet. Oh, right, I already spoiled this. Yeah, we got straight to the slums before we could do anything. After leaving, Lace shows up to taunt Hornet, but not fight her. Missed opportunity, if you ask me. It's here where Hornet makes it clear to Lace that she knows what she was captured for, and Lace reveals that the captor, and the reason the pilgrims have been driven mad, is a higher, god-esque being, giving us our final objective. We then proceed to ring one more bell, which causes this guy to get cranky because now a bunch of pilgrims will start flocking to the place. We'll get to him later. For now we proceed and are greeted by these statues which tell Hornet that she can pass to the highest point of the Citadel if she obtains 3 pieces of a melody that she will play on her needle by using her spider strings. You could almost say that it's here where the game truly opens up. Now it's on you to find all 3 songs in whatever order you so wish. This will have you going through various landmarks and tackling challenges in a variety of ways, some with additional prerequisites. Not only that, but the amount of side content and objectives opens up as well. The world is your oyster at this point. You could be on track to the main objective, only to see what's off to the side and get completely distracted by an entirely new biome with something special or a wholly unique challenge that you don't see anywhere else. In fact, 1 is a good action platformer, but not a great Metroidvania. Act 2 is a good action platformer and an even better Metroidvania. The feeling of freedom you get in Act 2 is incredible. Combined with the new side quests, you can find yourself being sidetracked 10 times over before you remember that there's a main objective, and it's so fun. And when you encounter something as unique as the prison escape in the slab, the feeling of exploration is only further increased. There's a sense of excitement whenever you find a new biome because you never know what to expect. And all the special abilities, new bosses, silk skills, even new crests make them even more rewarding to go through. Except for Bilewater. Oh yeah, I completely neglected to talk about this. One of the core parts of Silksong is tools. These take the place of the first game's charms, where you equip them to enhance your combat skills or general capabilities. With a few key differences. Instead of having costs for each tool and a maximum amount of equipment based on that, each tool is split into one of 3 categories. The yellow tools are mostly utility-based, covering for things like currency magnetism, map location, among others. The blue tools generally affect combat, be it defensive or offensive, and red tools are effectively weapons. These have limited supply and give a special projectile attack, then you restock them at rest benches. You equip these along with your silk skill to your crest, which has a certain number of slots for each type of tool, and can be even further expanded with a certain collectible. On the surface, this seems like a pretty basic rendition of the charms, but where the magic truly happens is when you factor in the other crests. These are entirely optional collectibles that, when equipped, completely alter how the game plays. Not just because of the changes to your attack animations and properties, but also because it comes with some new effect to stuff like your passive gameplay or the bind. These can be simple things like the Reaper's Crest letting you collect more silk after binding, or the upgraded Hunter's Crest enhancing your damage when you're not taking damage, to some out there changes like the Architect's Crest trading your silk skill for a 3rd red tool, or the Shaman's Crest doing the opposite. These crests also all have different amounts and types of tool slots. That, combined with the differences in gameplay, means that crests and tools can synergize in some very interesting ways. And the fact that each crest saved the tools equipped means it fixed an issue with charms in the first game. That game likewise had charms that serve various purposes, but if you wanted to switch from an exploration build to a combat or boss fight build, you would have to switch out every single charm for ones that are more suitable. Meanwhile in Silksong, if you have a crest built for exploration and a crest built for combat, you just switch to the appropriate crest instead of reassigning your tools over and over. And when Ava upgrades these even further and you gain access to universal tool slots, the possibilities only expand even further. The system provides the same depth and customization that charms do, but now with some streamlining and even more gameplay changing elements, making for an equally, if not more, in-depth system. Or you could be a stubborn bastard like me and mainly stick with the Hunter's Crest for the entire game. Oh yeah, speaking of things I neglected to talk about, this game's fucking gorgeous. The presentation as a whole is fantastic. There is so much detail in the environments, the animations are all great, and the sheer variety of the aesthetics and locales makes it always a treat to look at. There's rarely a biome that feels like another. It really gives you a glimpse of what this world could look like outside of an apocalyptic event and makes for a much more visually interesting experience compared to the first game's default aesthetic of grey wasteland. Which is another reason finding new areas is so fun, because you never know what kind of visuals or style it'll have and it makes you want to seek them out even more. Except for Bilewater. The music is also pretty solid. Not amazing or anything, but solid. Nothing is extraordinarily memorable. Like the first game, plenty of songs end up blending together because you're so focused on the gameplay and because the voice lines tend to drown it out. But I will say that I actually really like some of the environment themes. They nailed the feeling you get from passing through them. I've gone through Cogware Core more times than I ever needed to, but I can't say I was upset about it because that brief bit at the start of the theme is just really pleasant to listen to. Anyway, after getting sidetracked for a couple hours, I finally begin focusing on the main objective and get all 3 songs. And after ascending towards the highest point of the Citadel, we have another fight against Lace. Afterward, Hornet shares some sympathy towards her and what she is, and now that that's over, we finally make it to the mastermind behind all of this. Now, before that, one thing about this game I'm sure you've heard is that it is blisteringly difficult. And I don't understand why. Silksong is not easy, far from it, but it's not so difficult it's worth making a whole point about how difficult it is. There were definitely some difficult parts to it. Climbing the mountain to get the double jump, the prison escape, the Witch Crest quest. Wait, no fucking way I did that line on my first try. The cargo missions are a pain, unsurprisingly, but there was never a point, optional or otherwise, that had me agonizing through countless attempts over multiple hours just to finish it. I distinctly remember the first Hollow Knight being more difficult. Maybe my memory's just being skewed by the post-release content or something, but even then I can safely say that in Silksong, no platforming challenge was as ruthless as the Path of Pain, and no boss was as brutal as Radiance. Not even this game's true final boss. Now, difficulty aside, I will say the bosses of Silksong are one of the best parts about it. Not only because it gives you that fast-paced action that made the first game's bosses great, but also because of the unique way that they challenge you. Few bosses feel the same as another unless they're literally designed to be a clone. Whether it be the rhythmicness of the cogwork dancers, the sense of scale you get from the fourth chorus, to the way that Lace has you go back and forth in a way that makes you actually feel like you're in a fencing match. There were a lot of bosses I managed to beat on my first attempt, but adapting to them in a way that makes you feel like you're doing more than just memorizing new attack patterns is extremely fun. The only times repeated attempts became unfun were because the boss either had annoying patterns or area coverage, a dumb amount of backtracking, or because there was something about them on a mechanical sense that only served to hinder you. Something more important to note is that there were 2 standout bosses I beat on my first attempt, and were really disappointing because of that. First one is, pun not intended, the First Sinner. The speed of her attacks, the frequency, the way she teleports everywhere, the amount of space all the attacks take up, the fake out second phase, the fact that she self-heals in the same way you do. It's not only a cool boss on its own, but it's one that I definitely would have struggled with if this were teenage me playing the first Hollow Knight. But, like I said, that didn't happen. And even though I was on the verge of death multiple times, I miraculously beat her in one attempt. The second boss I disappointedly beat on one attempt is... You know what, I think I laid enough clues in this video for you to figure it out, so let's have fun. I want you to make an educated guess at what boss I'm about to talk about. Seriously, pause the video, or think about it as I'm talking right now, then leave a comment timestamping this part or something and let me know what your best guess is. If you guess it right first, I'll heart your comment or something, I don't know. Got your answer locked in? Alright, the second boss that I beat on my first attempt that was disappointing for that reason was Grandmother Silk, the first final boss. And if that doesn't speak volumes about why this was a disappointment, then I don't know what does. You remember how I said that the first ending of the game was an anticlimax, but not for any fault of the game's writing? Well, there you go. This obviously isn't the true final boss, but because of this lack of challenge, it barely creates the illusion of one. For the most part, her attacks are pretty straightforward, well telegraphed, and not too taxing to avoid. Again, I wouldn't say the fight is easy, per se, just not what you would want in even a fake final boss. You know, I didn't mention Dark Souls 1 in my storytelling rant, but even though the ending makes no sense to someone as knowledgeable about the lore as I am, the final boss was pretty damn tough. That, as well as the build-up to it, made the ending feel climactic. It's the feeling of, damn, this is my toughest opponent yet, this won't be easy, that makes it work. I died more times to the cogwork dancers in the second fight against Lace than the big looming entity they were guarding. It's just a big letdown, and I can't say much else about Granny here beyond that. But anyway, she is the final boss of Act 2, and after beating her, Hornet begins binding her, which causes her to gain immense power as shown by the interface. She keeps binding and binding until Silk explodes everywhere, covering every bit of the Citadel, and once the dust settles... Ah, well that can't be good. It seems the act of killing this godlike tyrant may well have been exactly what they wanted. Which means there must be a better way to end this conflict, and therefore another ending. So off we go to systematically check every single inch of the map so we can complete as many quests as possible to fill whatever the prerequisite was. I don't know what it was, I'm gonna be honest. You know, Act 2 was a definite high point of the game. Yeah, I know I already kind of gushed about it a bit, but the feeling of exploration, that aspect that makes Act 2 fun, is still present even when I'm doing this. I'm just backtracking through the world, searching for every nook and cranny I miss, but there's something weirdly cathartic about it. It's genuinely not that bad to backtrack in this game. It's actually enjoyable. Except for Bilewater. I've held my tongue long enough. Bilewater is a side area that can be accessed pretty early into the game, a swampy marshland full of maggots. And there's no easy way of saying this, it is easily the worst part of the whole game. The big gimmick of this biome, as well as adjacent ones, is the maggot-infested waters. Drop into them and you get covered in maggots. You can't get rid of them until you either bind, rest, or find clean water. And funnily enough, the debuff doesn't actually do anything else besides that. But when you remove it with binding, you don't get healed. Somehow, despite being all the maggots do, they are so annoying. Mainly because unless you equip a specific tool to prevent it, you constantly get afflicted by them because they latch if you so much as graze the waters they're in. And to make matters worse, there is zero grace period. If you bind to remove them, you could just as easily fall back into water and get maggots back on you the very millisecond that you get them removed. Meaning you just wasted a bunch of silk and have to wait even longer before you're allowed to heal again. Assuming you don't land in the water again or straight up die. Now, here's the thing. The maggots are annoying, but as I mentioned earlier, they show up elsewhere. But those biomes aren't even half as agonizing as Bilewater, still annoying though. It's the maggots combined with the actual geography of the biome that brews this satanic soup. Look at this map. Notice anything strange? Aside from being pretty fucking big, there's something else staring at you in the face. Right there. Yeah, you know how I said that benches are one way to get rid of maggots? Well, now look at the distance between them. And now imagine the pain of actually having to travel that distance. To make matters worse, this bench at the top and the path to its left unlocks when you beat the boss next to it, and the closest bench to that is hidden away, and I actually never found it. Furthermore, there's also a fake-out bench somewhere around here, and to make matters even worse, you can't even ignore all this swampy horseshit because the boss gives you an item that's critical to access Act 3. On top of that, the vertical travel is filled with zigzaggy, wide-open platforming with these fuckers, and the horizontal travel is extremely cramped, filled with traps. The boss arena even has maggot water. Everything about the zone sucks, and I dread every time I return to it. Yeah, it just sucks. The absolute worst part of the game, and it's not even close. But yeah, you need to go through the pain in order to make it to Act 3. You see, when you meet the proper conditions and talk to the Songclave caretaker to discuss a different way to defeat Grandmother Silk, This leads to a quest where you collect various parts for a trap, including souls from the old lady from the beginning, the hermit underneath Bellheart, and the one you get in Hell. After obtaining everything, the caretaker prepares the trap, allowing you to refight Grandmother Silk, but now at the end, instead of binding her, you play music to activate the trap. This causes dark tendrils to ensnare her, dragging her down. She grabs you, trying to take you with her, but you're saved at the last minute by Lace. Both of them vanish, the citadel crumbles, and Hornet falls. And when we zoom out to see the results, all seems fine. Ah, well that can't be good. It would seem that something somewhere went wrong. So now with at least one new question on our mind, this brings us to the final act of the game. The act opens with Hornet trying to navigate through the now crumbled down citadel to find something, I guess, not before having another aneurysm. Checking in on Songclave or returning to the Bell Beast would be a good idea. Oh yeah, did I mention that the Bell Beast is adorable? And this act reveals the most surprising and inconceivable truth about her. Now that we're back to a state of relative normalcy, this still begs the question, what happened? Well, this is the part of the game where I realized I probably should have refreshed my memory on the first Hollow Knight because some of what happens here probably would have been more significant to me. It's revealed that the caretaker, the maid, and the hermit are all actually snail shamans. This in of itself ties back to the first game in a significant way because the first NPC to actually assist you on your journey in that game was the snail shaman. I didn't remember that when I first got here, so I was a bit confused, I can't lie. Regardless, what can they answer about what just happened? It turns out the trap didn't actually kill Grandmother Silk, but it actually sent her to the Abyss. And now Farloom is practically being infected by Shadow Lace String and somehow causing the land to be in an even worse state. Was this always their plan? Maybe. But what's important to note is that the black string isn't actually the work of Grandmother Silk, it's the work of Lace. Turns out, if the trap worked as intended, things would probably be better, but nobody accounted for the fact that Lace would sacrifice herself to get caught in the trap as well. Now she's fused with the Abyss and is being driven mad. So even after the effort put in to avoid being turned into the new spider goddess, we still have a big mess to clean up. So now it's time for us to descend into the Abyss ourselves and survey the situation. This is where we learn that Lace is much deeper than we can feasibly reach without dying, and this is where we get the Silksong ability, allowing access to remaining areas, or at least most of them. This doesn't let Hornet descend, however, but she does know of a way, a white flower called the Everbloom. And yes, the very same delicate flower from the first game, which does shed some light on... Fuck, I promise that one wasn't intentional. Does shed some light on that one boss rush ending. Of course, they can only grow in that one place in Hollow Nest, and since doing a no-hit journey from there to here sounds beyond dreadful, Hornet intends for the shamans to conduct a ritual to manifest the flower by using her own memories. Don't worry, the flower won't break this time. Don't ask me why. However, the shamans can't just do the ritual, they'll need to draw power from the hearts of some strong bugs. To make that happen, they teach Hornet a new song that will allow her to enter the dream, or past, I guess, of the bugs in question. From this point, the goal is to go to 3 landmarks and use the song to obtain those hearts. As you'd expect, this entails a lot of backtracking. Where Act 3 difference from the rest of the game in that regard is, well, the complete upheaval of Farloom. Random enemies will be affected by the Abyss, making them stronger. The platforming is changed to accommodate and use new movement abilities you got throughout the journey. However, it is mostly the existing map that changed rather than new areas being available. In fact, outside of the Abyss itself, there's only one new biome you can find, and it's in another dream world, so you can't even revisit it. I'll touch on this a little more later, though, because the process of getting the hearts themselves isn't very long. After starting the ritual, we get visuals of Hornet's memories in Hollow Nest, and after obtaining the Everbloom, she wakes up and the shamans have seemingly evaporated. Now that we have everything, and by that I mean the one thing needed to make it down into the deeper Abyss, this brings us to the true final boss of Silksong. Lost Lace. She is easily the hardest boss in the game, packed with the same speed and fencing-like patterns of her previous encounters, but now fused with the infinite powers of darkness. Her existing attacks not only get way more AoE, and her counter can mix you up super easily, but she also completely pelts the screen with void projectiles, leading you to dodge, weave, and run at every chance and constantly pay attention to what's going on. And with 3 phases to go through, especially if you don't have the final needle upgrade, It's a war of attrition to say the least. I died plenty of times. This, right here, this is the kind of challenge I expect from Hollow Knight. Lost Lace may not be quite as ruthless and unforgiving as Radiance, but that's due in part to not needing to fight through half of another boss just to re-attempt it. And also because her damage output is pretty standard. It's rough, it's challenging, and it took a lot of attempts, but it's fun. It's a great boss to end with, and the build-up to it and the presentation makes it feel truly climactic. After this never-ending scuffle, Lace is defeated and freed from the Void's corruption. All that's left to do is leave, and Grandmother Silk lends you some help to get you and her daughter out of there. After relentlessly trying to escape the Sea of Darkness, the Everbloom eventually gives in, leaving the two of them open, and just before they get shredded, they get saved by something, and Hornet looks up to behold... Wait, what the fuck? And we then see the two of them are safe on the surface, or does it count as a surface? Whatever, you know what I mean. Now that the two have reached this point, the credits roll, for real this time, and now, obviously, we have to systematically go through every point we missed to fight Lace again and get full completion. And this involves revealing the most surprising and inconceivable truth about why we needed to find the missing fleas. And after finding everything I could, and looking up a guide when I gave up trying to do it on my own, Act 3, as well as the game as a whole, is finished. So that was Hollow Knight Silksong, a wild and fun game that ends on quite the high note, I would say. But if I'm being blunt, I think Act 3 was easily the weakest one. So let's begin the summary part of this video so I can explain why. I think each act in Silksong has their own strengths and weaknesses. Act 1 is, once again, a solid platformer but not a great Metroidvania. For the most part, it nails the feeling of going on a long and tough journey with trials and tribulations, but the feeling of open-ended exploration you get from a Metroidvania isn't that present outside of a linear path from the bottom to the Citadel. It'll branch off every now and then, but even then, the biggest branch off from the main path is Bilewater. Act 2 is a fantastic Metroidvania. The sheer volume to which the game opens up makes it so fun to play. The bosses you encounter, and the secrets you uncover, and the abilities and crests you can obtain, you just end up getting distracted and lost any time you spot something off the beaten path, and it's very fun every time it happens. It was easily my favorite, and what I would confidently call the best act in the game. Now, even Act 2 has its issues. This is the act where Bilewater becomes mandatory after all. And the ending boss is, unfortunately, very underwhelming. The ending bosses of the other acts were more challenging than her. And as for Act 3, what makes it the weakest act? Before I lay this out, I want to briefly re-establish what I talked about at the beginning of the video, where I stated that I expected this game to be good, but not worth the 7-year wait. Now, if Silksong met my expectations, that would mean that it does just that. And you see, part of the reason I even assumed that was precisely because the game took as long as it did. I may know basically nothing about game development, and I may not know what it takes to actually make a game on Silksong's caliber, but even a game dev layman such as myself is more than familiar with the concept of development hell. I don't know off the top of my head what caused the game to be delayed so much. Whatever the case may be, any game taking that long with a less than ideal development history is a pretty big red flag. Shigeru Miyamoto famously said that a rushed game will be bad and a delayed game will eventually be good. In theory, this is superbly rational. Yeah, if the game doesn't have enough time to improve, then of course it'll be bad. But the thing about that quote is that he's fucking wrong. Just this year, Nintendo themselves disproved this notion with Metroid Prime 4, a game that took well over a decade to come out and God knows how long just to develop, and curiously, it turned out to be garbage. Disclaimer, I have not played the game, nor will I ever. I'm bringing this up because I only hear bad things about it. Hell, if you need another example, then look no further than my last video. Yeah, I did make a second video where I said that I mostly stand by what I said, and even after tons of further counter-arguments, my stance remains the same. But what I will say is that the quality of the video itself simply doesn't meet the standards I set for myself. And a big reason as to why this is because it took too long to make. I spent so much time writing the script, and by the time I was editing the video, I saw too many faults in what I had and decided to redraft everything and start from scratch. But I was also so desperate to finish the video that I ended up half-assing a lot of stuff, still leading to a better script, but also leading to one that lacked some of the good parts of the scrapped one. My point being that time spent on a creative endeavor does not correlate to quality of the final product. There is every chance that delays and unforeseen circumstances could have stifled any form of quality control or caused deliberate choices that end up overcorrecting problems the game actually did have. I bring this up because by the end of Act 2, I thought the game was a perfectly serviceable follow-up to Hollow Knight. A good game in its own right, but not noticeably grander in scope. Once I started getting into the nitty-gritty of Act 3, I had a genuine feeling that the game would begin exceeding my expectations once I got further in. Alas, Act 3 didn't do much to improve or worsen my view of the entire game, and it was a noticeable low point for the whole experience, excluding the obvious. I wouldn't say it's without merit. The tone, for instance, is done really well here. It's a very abrupt shift, and you can feel the sense of despair and hopelessness in the atmosphere alone. But for every compliment I can give, actually, there's plenty more I can critique it for. The big issue is that the majority of the act is mandatory backtracking. If we go in order, then we backtrack through the Citadel and get everything in order. We backtrack to the beginning and find the snails. We spend a bit of time in the Abyss, get a new ability, and then backtrack through 3 separate areas that you likely already explored by this point, go through newly accessible areas in existing biomes, go back to the snails, then go through the Abyss again to face Lost Lace and beat the game. I absolutely oversimplified things here, but the fact it was so easy to do that without leaving too much out says a lot. Outside of the new areas and the existing biomes, there are only 2 new biomes that were previously inaccessible. The Abyss, bringing back the staple aesthetic of Grey Wasteland, and another one that's not only optional and pretty obscure to find, but also in a dream world, so once you finish, there's no returning. Sure, I was pretty meticulous in my Act 2 exploration, but regardless, this makes the scope of Act 3 feel much smaller than it already is. However, that's not the only underwhelming part of Act 3. The Void String caused a complete upheaval of Harloom, changing a lot of the map design to account for your new movement abilities, and adding some rubble to the Citadel so you can't just skip specific segments. It's pretty cool, all things considered, and helps the act stand out from the others, but honestly, I think it should have gone further. The way this was executed almost feels like the game is trying to have its cake and eat it. Like, the platforming changed, pilgrims are displaced, and there's a number of new roadblocks, but every important collectible is also still accessible so you can get 100% completion without starting a new playthrough. It's appreciated for sure, but at the same time I can't help but think there was an easy way to block them off while still having a means of obtaining them. That being said, overall, Act 3 isn't bad, just underwhelming. It starts strong, ends strong, but doesn't keep the momentum in between. The 3 bosses you fight are fun, but the process of getting them isn't very remarkable, or even a bit annoying. And it's kind of a letdown because this is the part of the game that could have easily exceeded my expectations, and that brings me to my conclusive statement about Silksong. The game overall is great. I had a very fun time. Even if Act 3 was disappointing or some of the bosses were weirdly easy, it was very enjoyable. I've compared it to Hollow Knight every now and then, but I'll be more direct now. Because if I think these 2 games are on par with each other, then considering everything I've said about Silksong, some explanation is in order. I mentioned before, I don't see Hollow Knight as the masterpiece that so many say it is, and yeah, I do think it's a bit overrated in that regard. That doesn't make it a bad game, far from it. Hollow Knight is good. It's really good. My memory's still a bit foggy, but I remember it being a consistently good game. And to me, that's the big difference between these 2 games. Silksong is similarly really good. Sometimes it's great. Sometimes it's fantastic. Sometimes it's unremarkable, and sometimes flat out bad. But it is not any of these things consistently. Silksong is all over the place in terms of quality, especially when compared to the first game. It has better controls, better storytelling, more variety in the environments and bosses, but these dips in quality is why I can't critically put either of these 2 games above or below each other. Even the things I can compliment come with caveats every now and then. Like how the tools are handled, for instance. You refill your red tools by spending another currency, which is nice, but because there's a carry limit and you're not always incentivized to use them, it makes times when you find a secret area just to be rewarded with a deposit of shards sting quite a bit. Fun. The first game just doesn't have this problem. And yeah, I don't think it was worth the 7 goddamn years of waiting. Not because the game is bad on its own, but because it just doesn't feel that much bigger in scope compared to the first game. I could understand this game taking that long if it was a debut project or something different to a previous one, but not so much for one that's so fundamentally similar to the first game. I suppose that speaks quite a lot about how difficult the development cycle was, but even with that in mind, Never underestimate what even solo devs can create within that time. Yeah, I know that's rich coming from me, you can shut your ass now. I can only hope this is a good learning experience from the team, and that things go smoother in the future. In summary, Hollow Knight Silksong may be underwhelming, and I wouldn't even put it in my personal top 5 games from this year, but I'm still happy that I played it. The game may not always be a great time, but it's very well made and executed outside of that. I wish I could recommend this to people who haven't played the first game, but unfortunately there will be plenty of parts that will be confusing if you haven't. And thankfully, if you did enjoy the first game, you will find plenty to enjoy here. If I were forced to pick one to replay, I'd be more inclined to play Silksong just for the smoothness of the controls and, in spite of my earlier criticism, the lack of bullshittingly difficult parts. It was honestly very close to surpassing the first game, and like the first game, if it sees free DLC to add on to it, and that DLC is great in terms of quality, then I might just put it above its predecessor in a heartbeat. And wouldn't you know it, as I was scripting this, we got confirmation of free DLC. So, fingers crossed. But as far as the present is concerned, it sits nicely alongside the first game, so I give Hollow Knight Silksong a still respectable 8 out of 10. Now, if you'll excuse me, I have a sudden urge to hunt down and kill every spider hiding in my room. Thanks for watching, everyone. Be sure to subscribe for more. I'll see you next time, and I wish you all a